Greetings to all of you from Virginia. I wish I could be there with you, but the risk of COVID has got me homebound here for the time being. I hope to come to the April work party. We'll see how COVID's going at that time, but at age 86 I have to be especially careful. I was at a work party about 15 years ago. It was a great experience. I'm always thrilled to see the Laffey veterans in the work party. We have such a loyal group. That's very unusual in the Navy or in the military to have such a dedicated group of volunteers. But even greater, I think, is having friends and family members also develop a loyalty to the ship and a willingness to work. And it's great to have you non-veterans in the group, especially including my son Mike, who is filming this and will show it to you when he's there next month. I used to live in the officers' quarters. It was just outside the door to chief's quarters. I suppose you're in chief's quarters right now watching this. But if you go out the door into the passageway, and the first door on the right goes into 3 little staterooms. And my final year in Laffey, I lived there. Previously, I lived back aft in the other officers' quarters. The officers were split into 2 locations on the ship in case we were hit by the enemy and half of the officers were killed, at least half would survive. That was the idea. So I served in 1956 to 59. I had enlisted in the Navy in 1951 as a junior in high school. In fact, I was sworn in before I was 17, and the Naval Reserve became my avenue for appointment to the Naval Academy. I just graduated in 1956 and came to Laffey, and promptly was sent off to ASW school in Key West for 2 months. Came back to the ship. The captain asked me how I liked anti-submarine warfare school, and I told him great, and he said, good, you're assistant chief engineer. I was the damage control assistant for a year, and then I went off to engineering school in Newport and came back in June of '57 and became chief engineer, literally and overnight from Saturday afternoon to Monday morning when we were underway, and spent a year as chief engineer, and then after a shipyard period in 1958 I became the operations officer, and that was my final year till I left the ship in 1959. Eventually I became a submariner, and most of my years were in submarine construction and design and repair. But anyways, back in Laffey, at the time I was aboard, of course we were mesmerized by the history of the ship. We flew the Presidential Unit Citation, which had been awarded to the ship and crew after the battle in Okinawa in April of 1945. So the history of the ship was always on our minds. In fact, we wore a ribbon. During that time, if you served aboard a ship that earned the Presidential Unit Citation, or the PUC, as we called it, PUC, you could wear the corresponding ribbon while you were serving in the ship. So I wore that ribbon for 3 years, and then when I left the ship I had to take it off. Same for everybody on the crew. But we had a pennant that we flew, that red-white pennant that we flew that indicated that our ship had earned the Presidential Unit Citation. We also had war damage still in the ship, because back in 1945 the ship was rushed into the shipyard and tried to get back out to sea as quickly as possible to continue the fight against the Japanese. They rushed through the repairs and sent her back out. She didn't quite make it in time because, of course, the war ended just 4 months later in August. She got out into the Pacific, but not into another battle. But still, 13 years later, we were fighting problems with warped doors, especially, and most especially electrical cables that had been simply cut in the shipyard, if they'd even were known about. Some of them were simply unrealized, unknown that they existed, but those that were visible or detectable were cut at the bulkheads on either side and left. And 13 years later, we had problems with compartment tightness, which was determined by an air test. We'd have leakage at the bulkheads and see that it was because of these cut cables, and it was a continuing job for us to pull these old cut cables out and weld plugs into the holes and restore the water tightness of the ship. So we were still fighting the aftermath of the battle 13 or more years later. But in those days, Laffey was primarily in the Mediterranean when we deployed. I don't recall we even used the word deployed in those days, but whatever it was called, we were usually in the Mediterranean. Also, we also were in the Caribbean and up in the North Atlantic above the Arctic Circle and in the Red Sea during my 3 years aboard. Our job was to contain the Soviets. That was the national concern at the time, early days of the Cold War, and we were attempting to maintain the Mediterranean Sea as an American lake. There were very few, if any, Soviet ships in the Mediterranean. They might come out singly on occasion. I never actually saw one, but they must have been there someplace occasionally. The American fleet, on the other hand, was many ships. At one time, we would generally have a squadron of destroyers relieve another squadron, or maybe even more ships than that, in the relieving process. So at the time of relief, there'd be twice as many ships. And I remember once being anchored in a harbor on the island of Malta, I believe it was. We had 47 ships anchored there at one time. 47 ships. But, so our war was a non-shooting war, as it turned out. Our job and my job for my 30 years in the Navy was, my small part in the total effort was to not shoot rather than shoot. But we were prepared to shoot. So we exercised at all sorts of things. During my time in Laffey, and of course in the years later, the whole fleet exercised at whatever wartime efforts might be necessary to contain the Soviets.